So it's a great pleasure for me to have you here today, Farid Masroor from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Farid is a philosopher of mind and philosopher of perception that has worked on many topics that are of interest for us. He's a specialist on the one hand, on intentionality, in particular on phenomenal intentionality. He was involved by Uriah Kriegel in the 2013 book on phenomenal intentionality, in which he gave a paper on phenomenal objectivity and phenomenal intentionality. And then I discovered that you also published a book on an Italian journal called Rivista Internazionale di Filosofia e Psicologia, again on this very topic. I was very curious about that to see your name there. But as I said, he's also an expert on perception. That is probably nowadays his main topic. Established an important paper some years ago on philosophy and phenomenological research. On 2011, his perceptual experience theme. And today he's talking to us about grasping spatial properties, advertisement for a structuralist proposal. Farid, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thanks for inviting me and for the opportunity to present my work. Let me just jump right into it. So the topic of this talk is a phenomenon about one of the epistemic roles of perceptual experience. So usually, when we talk about the epistemic role of perceptual experience, we are interested in how it grounds knowledge of empirical facts. I look at the scene and I say there are three circles in front of me and they have this or that color. And we are interested in how perceptual experience puts us in the position to know this, or gives us justification for the belief that there are three circles in front of me with such and such colors. But another interesting role of perceptual experience that is epistemic is that our perceptual experience also tells us something, or helps us, if you like, grasp the nature of some sensory properties. So for example, when you look at these three circles, in addition to coming to know that there are these three circles in front of you, one might argue that perceptual experience also puts you in the position to know that the color red is more similar to orange than it is to blue. And we can generalize this to other properties, sensory properties, sensible properties that are presented in experience too. So for example, when you look at this, some have argued that perceptual experience puts you in a position not just to learn or to know that there is a triangle or a circle and an ellipse in front of you, but also to learn something about the nature of triangularity, circularity, and ellipticality. For example, in this case, again, you might think that having this perceptual experience puts you in the position to see, understand, or grasp, this we can think about what the right term is, and I'll talk about that later. But just at the intuitive level, you learn that circles are closer in some sense, or more similar to ellipses than they are to triangles, just in virtue of having this perceptual experience. So talk about the epistemic significance of perceptual experience has mostly focused on knowledge of empirical facts, but another significant role of perceptual experience is its role is grounding a direct grasp of the nature of sensible properties. Because the examples that I was giving wasn't just learning some accidental or contingent fact about these sensible properties, but we feel intuitively that what you learn about these properties is something that has to do with their natures. It is in the nature of circularity that is more similar to ellipticality than triangularity, or it's in the nature of redness that is more similar to orange than it is to blue. So that is the intuitive idea. And you might think so, there is the idea seems intuitively convincing, but also and I'm going to call it grasp throughout this talk. But also, it looks like uh, a, an account of perceptual experience that denies grasp will create some sort of barrier between the mind and the world. In particular, denying grasp threatens to generate a deeply solipsistic picture of the mind, on which perception fails to put us in contact with how the world or might be qualitatively. So, for example, think about Frank Jackson's famous thought experiment about the Mary who is in the black and white room and gets released in the world. You might think, even before her release, she knew that grass is green. But one thing that she learns after her release is what it is for the world, what it is like for the world to be qualitatively uh, if grass is green. Because she learns something about the nature of greenness, something about the qualitative nature of greenness. And that is, if a view about perception has the implication that we have to deny grass, then it threatens to kind of slide into some sort of solipsism. And I'll talk more about this shortly. So the main question of this talk that I want to focus on is how should we explain grasp? And as I said, there are people in the literature that have already talked about grasp and or theses that are very similar to grasp or in the ballpark of grasp. And most of these people are Russellians about perceptual experience, by which, well, Russellianism is, I mean, a view that holds that worldly sensible properties enter the constitution of phenomenal character of experience and therefore determine its phenomenal character. So what it is to have a red experience is to be in a state that somehow includes redness as its constitutive components. And redness is a property out there in the world. There are, Russellian representationalists, most externalist representationalists, famous externalist representationalists are Russellians. But there are also relationalists, naive realists, direct realists, who are all Russellian about the phenomenal character of experience. And Russellians who advocate grasps, some of them have claimed that Russellianism provides a straightforward explanation for grasp. How do we explain grasp? Uh, because on the Russellian view, uh, basically, uh, we are acquainted with these sensory properties. The sensory properties are, if you like, before our minds, and we are kind of, they disclose their nature. And it is because we are acquainted with those that we are in the position to know something about the nature of these properties. So that's the Russellian explanation of grasp. I do not advocate the Russellian account of perceptual experience. For reasons that I've discussed in writing at many places, I reject Russellianism. The view that I advocate is a Fregean view, where the phenomenal character of experience is constituted by the way we perceive objects and their properties, not by what those objects and properties are, but the way that we perceive uh, objects and properties. My version of Fregeanism is somehow non-standard because I combine that with a form of relationalism. So I hold that perceptual experiences are constituted by direct relations to objects, but the phenomenal character of perceptual experience is a matter of how those objects and properties are perceived, not a matter of what those objects and properties are. But there is a general question. As I said, it looks like Russellians have a straightforward explanation of grasp. How should a Fregean explain grasp? That's the question of the paper. But I'll do some stage setting before giving an answer. So in this paper, I want to give a Fregean answer to this question. That's the goal of the talk. Um, but it is a little bit more limited than what I just said. I am going to focus, John, just on a Fregean account of the grasp of spatial properties. By spatial properties, I mean properties like shapes, you know, uh, straightness, curvature, the properties that are usually the object of a study in geometry. There's a question whether spatial properties should be understood as properties that are physical or not. I'm gonna treat them for now as abstract properties that are studied in geometry. Okay, so here's the plan. In the first part, I'm going to say a little bit more on what I mean by grasp, kind of in an attempt to precisify the idea. And in part two, I'm going to argue against Russellian explanations of grasp. And in part three, I will illustrate the Fregean view by presenting a view that I call the strict structuralism. Strict structuralism is a specific version of a Fregean view that is a specific version of generic structuralism. And I'll say what this strict structuralism is and how it explains grasp. And then in part four, I'll say a little bit about how this view of strict structuralism or other versions of structuralism can be grounded in perceptual psychology. I will provide a recipe for that. And at the end, I will, sorry, that should be part five. I will end the talk by talking about generic structuralism and other forms of structuralism, because a strict structure, the role of presenting a strict structuralism is to illustrate one version that the structuralism can go. And then I will talk about other versions of structuralism that one can generate by relaxing some of the assumptions of strict structuralism. Okay, so let's start by saying a little bit more on grasp, and in particular grasping spatial properties. So I presented grasp at the beginning as the intuitive thesis that perceptual experience uh, puts us in a position, in a specific epistemic position, like understanding or grasping something about the nature of sensory properties. There are a lot of questions about what is the best way to articulate this idea, and it has been articulated in a variety of ways. The version that I like is something like this. Perceptual experience essentially puts us in the position to find some essential truths about its target, and this is a version restricted to spatial properties. Target spatial properties, uh, uh, finding something about the nature of those primitively compelling when we reflect on how these properties are phenomenally manifest in experience. So, sorry, this is a lot of words. So let me say a little bit about what I mean by why I'm choosing some of these technical terms. So I'm saying perceptual experience essentially puts us in the position because grasp is supposed to be a thesis about the nature of perceptual experience. It's not some accidental fact about perceptual experience that it does so for us, does this job. It is perceptual experience is the kind of relation that has it in its nature that it puts you in this position to have some sort of epistemic relationship to the nature of some spatial properties, some spatial properties. So theses about natures, in my view, should be formulated in terms of essences. And, this is kind of a new technical tool, somewhat new, has become popular in the past decade in philosophy to formulate theses about natures in terms of essences. It used to be all about, modal terms, but now people have shifted into essences. Another way that we could have formulated this thesis is to say that it is something that is necessarily true about canonical cases of perceptual experience. So all canonical cases of perceptual experience have this property. They put you in a position to have some sort of epistemic relationship with the nature of the properties that they present. If people are interested, we can talk about that formulation too. And there are questions about what's the best way to analyze what canonical cases of perceptual experience are. Are they cases of veridical perceptual experience, or are they cases of non-defective exercise of perceptual capacities? There are all sorts of interesting questions here about how to formulate. The second thing about this formulation is this idea that I'm appealing to primitive compellingness as opposed to knowing. So as I said, the intuitive idea behind grasp is that it puts us in some sort of epistemic relationship, epistemic position with respect to its target properties. There are, again, interesting questions about how we should understand that epistemic position. One common formulation is that people think that grasp puts us in that epistemic position because it puts us in the position to know something about the nature of these properties uh, by reflection on those properties. Knowing is a very demanding epistemic relation. I prefer a weaker relation, and that's the relation of finding something primitively compelling. And this is something that I get from Peacock that has played an important role in some of his view. And the idea is that you find something primitively compelling under reflection when you find yourself uh, in the you find yourself compelled to assent to its truth, but not so in virtue of finding yourself compelled to assent to the truth of something else. So when it is something is primitively compelling, it's basically compelling, but not in virtue of something else being compelling. So it's kind of a notion that is formulated to kind of emphasize that you have some sort of non-inferential epistemic relation to the facts about the nature of these properties. And of course, putting you in the position requires a set of background conditions. You need to have proper concepts, and you need to have capacities like attending, evaluating reasons, or are packed into this idea of primitive compellingness. So that's kind of the formulation, but that I like. But for the purposes of this talk, we don't need to kind of uh, the details are not important. If you prefer, for example, to formulate it in terms of being positioned to know, or you prefer to formulate it in terms of um, canonical cases of perceptual experience, it's not going to make any difference to what I arguably it's not going to make any difference to the arguments that I'm going to give or to the explanation I'm going to provide. So you should feel free to replace this kind of characterization with the characterization that you might find more convincing with that kind of articulation of grasp. Uh, so who accepts grasp? Some Russellian representationalists, these are unorthodox or non-standard Russellian representationalists, people like Adam Potts and David Chalmers, have embraced grasp, although nobody has explicitly defended grasp, but they have said things that entail grasp. They are non-standard Russellian representationalists because for them, perceptual experience is constituted by relation to a domain that Chalmers calls Edenic, Adam Potts calls the domain of abstract properties. Perceptual experiences are constituted by relations to those elements in that domain. So, on Chalmers' view, there are these Edenic spatial properties. There are Edenic colors. They are denizens of, if you like, a third realm. They're not in the world of particulars. They're not in the mind. They're kind of in the clouds, if you like. And perceptual experience is a direct relation, partly, to those properties. And they kind of, Chalmers and Potts, they have Russellian views. Those properties basically determine the phenomenal character of experience. And Potts has explicitly presented this as kind of uh, explaining why is it that when you have perceptual experience, you're in a position to know some essential truths about these properties. And he actually presents this as a virtue of the theory that he adopts and Chalmers also adopts, because this theory can explain the datum that perceptual experience puts us in this position to know these truths. Then he thinks that that's kind of uh, uh, evidence in support the truth of his theory. But there is also a different group diametrically opposed to these uh, uh, representationalists who are also Russellian, and those are sometimes called relationalists, sometimes naive realists. People like Bruel and Campbell, they have the view that perceptual experience is a direct relation to items in the world. There are a lot of other naive realists, Mike Martin, all the disjunctivist camp. But in particular, Brewer and Campbell have been interested in this specific epistemic role of experience, and they have advocated thesis also. The thesis that they explicitly advocate, especially Brewer in a 2019 paper that he has written, is the idea that perceptual experience uh, acquaintance with the categorical nature of sensory properties, colors, spatial properties. And in a 2006 paper, Campbell adopts a thesis like this that he calls transparency. Brewer calls this revelation. And it's this, some of you might know about this thesis. Their conception of thesis is a little bit different from Johnston's revelation or what Alex Byrne and um, David Hilbert called revelation. The idea is that you are acquainted with the categorical nature of properties in having perceptual experience. And this is the thesis that I think commits them to what I'm calling grasp, because the best way to understand what it is to be acquainted with the categorical nature and being in the position to know the categorical nature is that it implies that you should be in a position to know some essential truths about the nature of those properties. So this is another group. Uh, these are also Russellian in that they think that the targets of perception enter those properties, enter the constitution of the phenomenal character of experience. And they share that with Chalmers and Potts, but their conception of what those target properties are is very different. On the relationalist view, these target properties are property instantiations in the world, particular objects in the world, but on the Potts Chalmers view, they are, these Edenic elements, if you like. What they uh, so this kind of brings in that the conception of grasp that these people accept is also radically different. People like Chalmers and Potts believe in what you might call Edenic grasp. The primary targets of grasp are properties in the Platonic domain, and the other group embraces a concrete grasp. Uh, and so this is related to something that I said during the introduction, which was this idea that accepting grasp helps us explain, kind of get in some sense out of a solipsistic circle. Uh, the degree to which it does that depends on the version of the thesis of grasp that you accept. So if you accept direct concrete grasp, where phenomenal character grounds knowledge of how the world, acquaintance with the nature of property instantiations, things in the world of the concrete and particular objects, then if grasp is true, then you can give a nice explanation of how phenomenal character of perceptual experience plays a role in grounding our knowledge of how the world is like qualitatively. If you accept Edenic grasp, that knowledge basically is about Edenic properties. And it doesn't tell you exactly how the world is qualitatively. It only tells you something about how the world should be if it is matches your, the way the Edenic properties are presented to you. So the mind gets out of its own, internal circle, but it only goes to the Edenic domain and kind of it reaches that far. If you deny grasp, then you will be kind of within a solipsistic circle. So, for example, when Mary, who knows grass is green, gets released out of her room, if you deny grasp, what she learns is something akin to self-knowledge. She learns what it is like to be in a position to experience grass. She doesn't learn anything about the world of particular around herself. She doesn't learn anything about the world of the Edenic properties, what colors are in the Edenic world. She just learns something about her own mental states. So denying grasp is kind of pushes us in that position. And that's exactly one of the things that is interesting about accepting grasp and being able to explain it, is that kind of it helps us with this kind of getting out of the solipsistic circle. But as I said, the degree to which it does that depends on the version of grasp did you adopt? I adopt concrete grasp, and I think actually concrete grasp also grounds some sort of Edenic grasp. But in the talk that I'm giving, um, uh, it's not crucial, at least for what I'm presenting. Although some problems might come up that need a solution, that kind of there one can emphasize that here is someone who accepts concrete grasp is in a better position to deal with those problems. But for the purposes of talk, I'm talking about grasps in both the concrete and the Edenic senses. It doesn't matter which one you want to adopt. So we are kind of like we learn something about properties, or if you like, property instantiations directly in virtue of having perceptual experience. And we have to tell an extra story about how we think about it as concrete or Edenic and how they are related to each other. We can set that aside for now. Okay, so as I said, I want to argue that there is something problematic about the Neuraselian explanation of grasp. So let's just talk about that with an example. I gave you example of shape similarities. Here is another hypothetical example. So suppose when in some cases when you see a straight line, you find the idea that a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points primitively compelling. Let's just grant that as an example. Some people might disagree that that ever happens to them, that when they look at a straight line, they feel it is the shortest path between 2 points. That's you might think an essential truth about the straight lines, relative to specific geometries, of course. But let's say that is the case. Our question is, why is it that perception does that? How is it that perceptual experience have the power to do so? And the Russellian, that I'm going to call the neo-Russellian explanation, says something like this. It is in the nature of straight lines that they are the shortest path between 2 points. And in having an experience of a straight line, you're acquainted with the nature of straight lines. So you're basically, that fact is before your mind, and that's why it strikes you as primitively compelling that the line that you have perceived is the shortest path. It's basically kind of the idea of acquaintance and how it grounds or puts you in a position to know or find primitively compelling certain things. So we can put a little bit more meat on this. The Neo-Russellian will give us a story like this. It is a consequence of Russellian relationalism. That's the view that perceptual experience is a relation to certain items, targets, like properties or property instantiations, and they enter the phenomenal character of experience. So they hold that it's a consequence of that we are acquainted with the categorical basis for the essential truths about the property, because the property itself is the categorical basis for the essential truths concerning that property. And given the relevant set of background conditions, for example, conceptual capacities, the capacities to reflect and evaluate reason, experiential acquaintance with the categorical basis for an essential truth is sufficient for putting us in the position to find this truth primitively compelling. So again, you can say this, apply this idea to the other examples. Certain colors are the categorical basis for certain essential truths about colors. So the color green, the color blue, the color orange, red being what they are, that is the ground for which it is the case that red is more similar to orange than it is to blue. And when you're presented with that redness, orangeness, and blueness, those categorical bases, that puts you in a position to see that redness is more similar to orange than it is to blue. So that's the kind of Neo-Russellian explanation. Now, I think this Neo-Russellian explanation runs into some problems. And the intuitive problem is something like this. If you really think that being presented with the categorical nature of something, or the categorical basis of certain other facts about that property is sufficient, granted certain background condition, to put you in the position to know essential truths, then it follows that you're committed to, given the proper set of background conditions, all essential truths about the property should be knowable by perceptual experience. So you're committed to some sort of omniscience implication if you are. But that is definitely, it seems completely false. Uh, so uh, a lot of essential truths about properties, especially spatial properties, shapes and things, are truths that we do not find primitively compelling or are not in a position to know just by reflection on the basis of our experience. But it is an implication of Russellianism that you should be able to if all the relevant background conditions are in place. So this is a reductio against, we have a reductio against Russellian, neo-Russellian explanations. Um, that's kind of the basic idea of the argument. And then a Russellian, of course, can give two possible responses. They can say, of all the essential truths about spatial properties that I cannot know by reflection, the reason I don't know by reflection is that the background conditions fail. So a lot of sophisticated mathematical geometrical theorems about shapes, for example, the reason I cannot know them on the basis of experience is that I don't have the sophisticated concepts. Uh, or I don't have, the kind of like understanding what those truths are requires keeping a big amount of information in my head, and I can't do that. There are all these background conditions that fail. That's why there are some things you can know and some things you cannot know. That's one response. The other response would be to say, well, we should restrict neo-Russellian explanations. Maybe there is a set of fundamental facts about these properties that you can know just by experience. And those fundamental facts ground other facts. But we can restrict it to certain fundamental, in the metaphysical sense, fundamental facts. So let me just say a little bit in response to this. This discussion, of course, is not conclusive, and there's a lot more to say about this. But I'm going to quickly say two things about why I find these two responses not very convincing. So the first one is that of course, one needs to develop this idea of what the background conditions are, what the concepts are. But there are many cases where the facts that you cannot know just on the basis of perception are facts that employ very simple concepts that are concepts that are used in some other cases where some people claim that they can just know facts about properties on the basis of perception. So this, for example, is an example of a simple uh, theorem in geometry, in Euclidean geometry, that employs, many of us learned this in school. It employs very simple concepts. This called one of the circle theorems. If you form basically two angles, one of them its corners on the center of a circle. The other one, its endpoints are exactly the same, but its tip is on the circumference of the circle. It is always the case that this angle is half of this angle. And interestingly, if you put this D, for example, here, because this other angle that you will form will be, again, half of this angle that you form by choosing another point of the circumference will always be equal to the previous angle. These the concepts are employed here are angles, equality of sizes, nothing super sophisticated. But I would guess, I don't find this primitively compelling by reflecting on the character of my experience. And I would guess if someone claims that they do find it primitively compelling, maybe they can run a proof in their head very quickly, and that's why they find it primitively compelling. It's in an inferential knowledge. It's not knowledge by reflection and experience. You can even think of examples of much more kind of, theorems in geometry that employ even simpler concepts and abilities. There are, theorems of incidence that are about whether lines intersect with each other in a space or not. I had another example that I thought it would take too much time to explain, called the Posh axiom, that is about the incidence and intersection of angles. But in general, there are a lot of theorems that employ simple concepts, simple abilities. You don't need to kind of have a very sophisticated set of things large amount of data to imagine or consider, um, but they are not knowable in this just by reflection on experience. And I think this is kind of a trivial fact that many of us agree. Basically, many essential geometrical truths are truths that we can only come to have a view about by proof or other forms of theorizing, not by reflection on experience. But it looks like uh, that is something that clashes with the Neuraselian explanation. Um, and the other version, the other response was to restrict it to fundamental truths. So there are some fundamental geometrical, this is kind of like some of you who might be familiar with the Euclidean project, there has been kind of this idea that, there are some fundamental truths, for example, some of the ones that were expressed in Euclid's postulates and axioms that you just know that they are true when you when you see them, and then the rest all depends on this. Uh, and let's restrict the Neuraselian explanation. So there are only those essential truths are the ones that we know by reflection and experience. I think this also falls into basically the same problem that the Euclidean program falls into. The idea is that there is an epistemic order, things that is about which things you know first, as it were, and which things are you know on the basis of the things that you know first. And then there is a metaphysical order, which things determine the truth of other things. And the idea behind this project was that the metaphysical orders and the epistemic orders coincides. The things that are the most fundamental truths about geometrical properties are the ones that you know first by kind of some sort of a priori intuition or some other thing, or in this case, if you apply to here, by kind of the position that your perceptual experiences puts you in. Um, uh, but that idea uh, is a very, very substantive idea that is arguably wrong, and many people have rejected it. Uh, a lot of fundamental truths in geometry, like fundamentals in set theory, are truths that we come to know abductively. We basically try to systematize and structure our, diverse intuitions about certain cases. Here are some things that we find convincing or true in geometry, but those are usually mid-level things. Then you axiomatize your system and you come up with a set of basic principles that some of which are not primitively compelling or are not things that you know just by reflection on the experience. And those are the fundamental truths, like Hilbert's axioms. Some of Hilbert's axioms of incidence, for example, we do not find primitively compelling. You set those as the foundation. Those are the metaphysical foundations. And the ones that you find primitively compelling are at the mid-level. So this uh, response also doesn't work. So I don't think that the Neuraselian explanation can explain this certain simple fact about grasp, which is that grasp is often incomplete and partial. And it looks like now, if the idea is that essential truths about the property because it enters the phenomenal character, then you have to explain why is it that only some of the essential truths about that property. And I don't think that they can overcome this problem. So basically, explain the partiality of grasp is something that the Noah Hesselian has trouble explaining. Okay. So now so this was the setup. Actually, I'm almost out of. When did I start? I've been talking, I think, for 40 minutes. Did I start at 9? Uh,
You started at 10 past.
10 past? Okay,
Yes.
so I have talked for 37 minutes. I have to speed up. Okay, so I think the Russellian explanation doesn't work. The question is, what would the Fregean explanation be like? Uh, so here's the intuitive idea. The Russellian said, when you see straight lines, you know that they are the shortest path because you're confronting their nature. The Fregean explanation is something like this. To experience something as a straight line, in some occasion, is to experience it as the shortest path. That's kind of the idea. And that's why experiencing a straight line sometimes puts you in a position to know that it's the shortest path. But to experience a straight line is not to experience it as satisfying, always satisfying some very sophisticated mathematical theorem. So that's why you don't know those theorems. So basically, the Phrygian, that's the kind of basic idea behind the Phrygian explanation. So, or to experience something as a circle, in some cases, is to experience it intuitively. It's put it in a structural role that is partially defined in terms of the relationships of similarity and difference between circles and other shapes. That's why you find circles are more similar to ellipses on the basis of experience, more primitively compelling, but you don't find circles are similar to triangles primitively compelling. So the basic idea is that, if so, the Freudian can be a structuralist about the way we experience things. To experience properties, it's to put them in some sort of uh, role that is a structural role. And if we kind of develop this idea and link it with some sort of a structuralist view about the nature of properties, we get an explanation of grasp that would be Freudian. So let me move on to a view that kind of does that, and I'm going to call it a strict structuralism. This illustrates the structuralist idea in more detail. So uh, what I'm calling generic structuralism, that the strict structuralism view is combines three theses. One, the first thesis is a structuralist thesis about the nature of spatial properties. Is tell you that the nature of spatial properties is exhausted by their structural rule. Uh, and then there is a structural thesis about the nature of experiences of spatial properties. Or if you like, because we are working now within a Phrygian mode and experiences their phenomenal character constituted by modes of presentation, it is based on structuralism about what modes of presentations are. And then it tells you that there is an interesting relations, call it matching as a generic term, between the structure of experience and the structure of its target properties. That's kind of the generic structuralist thesis. In the case of strict structuralism, these generic theses are replaced with very specific theses. So the strict structuralist about spatial properties says that what it is to have a specific structure, spatial property, is is exhausted by a structural role, and you should get that structural role from mathematical theory. So uh, to be a circle is to, or to be circular is to occupy the role circular, and the role circular is given and specified in mathematical theory. How is that specified in mathematical theory? The technical machinery for getting a role out of a theory is the Ramsey process. You get a theory, you form a conjunction, you do some pruning, basically, um, and get rid of redundancies, and that can go in a variety of ways. You end up with a theory that is a big conjunction. You Ramsify that theory, then that theory, basically the ramified version of that theory, that says that there are these kind of it basically quantifies over these properties that you want to associate with roles. You say there are these variables ranging over uh, uh, in this case properties, and those properties, what they are specified in the ramified version of your theory, or your theory radical, if you like. But the basic intuitive idea is that uh, you know uh, properties are associated with roles, and the technical machinery to get these roles is the process of ramification. So the strict structuralist says that the spatial properties are identical with mathematical structural rules, basically. I mean, I'm speaking loosely here. To be very precise, you have to say the structural properties play the roles. Uh, but I'm speaking a little bit loosely. We can be more precise about this, but I'm trying to stay at an intuitive level. And then it combines that with a structuralism about experience and a specific conception of what matching is. So let me say how the stricter structuralist construes these. Uh, to say that, we have to first talk about what I call a uniquely identifying substructure. So you take your huge mathematical theory after your pruning. Uh, there are subsets of these the truths of that theory that might have this property, which is that if you ramsify them, they will also uniquely identify certain properties. Let's call those substructures uniquely identifying substructures. Uh, so, for example, you might say, get one sentence is a closed curve on two-dimensional plane, which is my rough intuitive way of putting a Ramsey-fied version of a theorem that the truth that uh, circles, for example, are closed curves in two-dimensional plane. That does not uniquely identify circles because there are other things that are closed curves in a two-dimensional plane. But in Euclidean geometry, a closed curve on a two-dimensional plane that includes a point that is equidistant from all points on its curve, that uniquely identifies circles. So the basic idea would be then that that is a substructure, uniquely identifying substructure of your mathematical theory. So the basic idea behind the other two theses is that when you experience circles, you put them in a structural roles called that R, and that structural role R matches, or is actually, sorry, I shouldn't say match. Match is the generic term. Is identical with a uniquely identifying substructure in your theory. So intuitively, it's like something like this. Mathematics tells us on an structural analysis that to be a circle is to occupy a structural role, and there are many substructures of that structural role that are still uniquely identifying circles. So to be a circle is to occupy this role or that role or many roles that are out there. And to experience a circle is to experience it as occupying one of those roles in some occasions, right? Uh, so that's kind of the idea of behind the strict structuralism. And when I'm using the notation experiencing as here, that's what my way of talking about Fregean modes of presentation. So don't read any, experiencing as is to conceptualize something. It is basically my notation for talk about modes of presentation. Okay. So going back to the basic idea, the thing that we wanted to explain, why do you find the idea that a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points primitively compelling? Because to experience the straightness of a line is to experience it as the shortest path between 2 points. In some occasions, doesn't have to be always the case. It is something like that. In some occasions. Okay, so I think this picture, specifically structuralism, actually can be grounded in empirical psychology. So I want to quickly kind of talk about how that will go. So we're gonna take a detour into empirical psychology and see how do we kind of get the e-structuralist component of the generic structuralist view out of that. So one thing to note is that in perceptual psychology, I mean psychology in a more restricted sense, this does not include, for example, neuroscience, but maybe it does include computational neuroscience. But I'm talking about mid-level psychology. Many psychological laws in perceptual psychology are basically law-like constraints over the relationship between contentful states. Uh, so, for example, take the perceptual psychological literature on depth, how we discern depth in vision from linear perspective. Uh, so that is usually written as a perceptual law like this. So take this case, you look at these rails. Uh, your perception of the relative depth of these two lines, D and D prime, is a function of uh, this S sub D and S sub D prime is the apparent size of D and D prime. Apparent size of D is larger than apparent size of D prime. and your perceptual systems of assumptions about the actual size of d and d prime. In this case, because this is a railroad, our perceptual system makes the assumption that d and d prime are actually have the same size, uh, and your perception of the depth is basically is a function of the degree to which the apparent size of d prime is smaller than d. So it's basically a function, your perception of depth of these, your representation of these other parameters. Uh, and this function is written in terms of relationships among the contents of these representations. Here's another example. Here's another way to perceive depth. That's depth from motion parallax. That is a procedure that the perceptual system employs when it is moving. That gives it more information. And the basic idea is that things that are in closer to you, they have less depth. Uh, seem to move faster when you're moving than things that are farther away from you. So depth from motion parallax again can be written as a function over contents. It's the perceptual psychology tells us that the way we perceive depth is a function of our representation of the speed of our own movement and the representation of apparent motion of objects. In the simple case where we are, apparent motion is relative to a fixed background. Sorry, in a, yeah, the background that you is the point of fixation is the horizon. This takes a simple formulation, and in the case where it is not, it takes a more sophisticated formulation. But the basic point that I want to make is that a lot of perceptual laws that we study in perceptual psychology are law-like relations among contentful states that tells you there is this relationship between representation of depth and your representations of other things. That's the point that I want to make. Now, the crucial point is that these laws can be interpreted in two different ways. A very common interpretation that a lot of us assume, or even a lot of psychologists assume, is what we might call a transitional interpretation. When we are saying that perceptual experience, our perceptual system is functioning according to these laws, we are saying that it basically transitions from a representation of, say, apparent size to a representation of depth, and this function is governing how it transitions. So basically, these perceptual laws are telling you how our perceptual system goes from one state to another state, how it computes the value of depth from the value of apparent size, right? But there is also another interpretation that is possible that would be basically completely compatible with the psychological data that is given in support of these laws, which I call the constitutive interpretation. That tells you that these laws describes structures that are constitutive of experiencing spatial properties. So basically, if we, for example, go to motion parallax, the constitutive interpretation tells you that to perceive something as being this or that deep in the environment is to perceive it as moving with this apparent speed as opposed to another apparent speed. Or to perceive something like in the case of uh, depth from linear perspective, to perceive it as set this deeply is to perceive it as occupying a role that this law tells you. So you basically can see that the constitutive interpretation is I'm going to jump over this because I'm running out of time. The constitutive interpretation is closely associated with this idea of ramification. When you give a constitutive interpretation of a perceptual law, you're saying that the perceptual law is specifying certain roles and telling you that to represent a specific parameter is to associate it with a specific role that your function identifies. So basically, you can get e-structuralism, experiential structuralism, by getting from your psychological theory, by basically ramifying your psychological theory. You can start with the perceptual laws that are operative in perceiving a spatial property in a specific concept. You separate those laws that should be interpreted constitutively. I don't think that every psychological law should be interpreted constitutively. Some of them should be interpreted constitutively, and ransify the conjunction of those. Uh, so you get the structural roles. And the assumption behind this is that your phenomenal structure, the structural roles that are kind of contained in the constitution of the phenomenal character of experience, mirror the structural roles that you have in perceptual psychology. Uh, so if this recipe works, you're going to end up with a uniquely identifying substructure, and that uniquely identifying substructure is going to match some substructure in your mathematical theory. So basically, you can ground structuralism, experiential structuralism in psychology. You can ground your structural analysis of spatial properties in the theory of your choice. In a strict structuralist case, that is mathematical theory. And then you can assume that there is an interesting relationship between those two structures. In the case of strict structuralism, that relation is that of identity, type identity. But you can relax that. I'm gonna jump. There is an interesting, a lot to be said about which perceptual laws are constitutive, what kind of empirical evidence. I think it's a tractable question, which perceptual laws are constitutive and what goes in there. I'm gonna jump over this to save time. So I have told you how to ground the structuralism and perceptual psychology. Let me just return to say a few words about generic structuralism and its relationship to strict structuralism. So the view that I used to illustrate structuralism was a strict structuralism. Strict structuralism is very demanding. It identified the spatial properties with mathematical structural roles. Uh, it doesn't say much about how to get E structures, but it assumes that the relationship between the structure of experience, whatever it is, and the mathematical structure is that of identity. Those are all make this view a very demanding view. But also, they also tell us how you can retain a view to be generically structuralist view by relax it. So, wait, okay. So there are multiple ways to relax strict structuralism to get other versions of structuralism. So you can start with a base mathematical theory and add physics to it, maybe add folk physics to it. You can even kind of live out your base mathematical theory and give a much more intuitive kind of theory that gives you an analysis of nature. So, for example, suppose I kind of use folk physics as opposed to mathematics. That would have statements like things that are circular roll smoothly on surfaces, or things that are higher than this height are not climbable. Uh, that would be kind of your folk physics kind of linked to your embodiment. Get all those statements, form a conjunction, you will get a theory, ramsify that. Of course, there are going to be technical issues about whether your theory is consistent. All of that needs to be properly handled. But the idea is that you can relax your structuralism in one dimensions. To relax your structuralism is to replace mathematics with a more intuitive theory that may be more intuitively related to grasp. You can another way to relax your structuralist analysis of these properties is to allow for a structurally unanalyzable intrinsic features. Some people even have argued that a ramified mathematical theory is not going to be uniquely identifying because we're going to have these unanalyzable intrinsic features that distinguish these properties from each other that don't show up, that distinction doesn't show up in our theory. So it's not going to be, properties are more fine-grained than structural roles. You can even allow for those. The thing is that even if there are some intrinsic aspects, for example, to circularity, those are not the ones that we grasp and we have experienced or we want to explain. Those are not part of the essential truths. The essential truths that we grasp are all structural. As long as you have that, you can relax and allow for those intrinsic elements. Another way to draft structuralism is to drop the unique identification requirement. It doesn't have to be the case that the structural roles uniquely identify properties. You can appeal, especially if you want to explain concrete grasp, you can appeal to actual relations, causal relations, and in the case that I'm interested in, because I'm a Fregean relationalist, perceptual relations to the environment that just do the job of narrowing down your target. So you're basically structural slash descriptive machinery doesn't have to uniquely identify. You can appeal to these structural relations, and that's one area where concrete structuralism has concrete grasp has a better kind of chance to be explained than what I call the Denic grasp. You can relax your structuralist point. You can allow indeterminacy or probabilistic, characterization of structural layers. And you can also allow other approaches to perceptual experience, like embodiment approaches, for example. Someone like Alvin Noah, for example, or some other embodiment theories might say that to experience something as, I don't know, smaller than a specific size is constituted, that experience, by experiencing at something that I can hold in my hand. So you can give, structural analysis of what it is to experience something in terms of, structural laws, but your structural laws bring in, other approaches, not just, what I presented here is the kind of mainstream standard content approach to perceptual psychology. You can bring in other approaches. And finally, you can relax structuralism by relaxing the relation of matching. Strict structuralism assumes that experiential structures have to be type identical with your structural analysis of the properties. But maybe you can have some kind of relaxed relations. Maybe experiential structures approximate the substructures that you get from whatever theory you use as your base to ramsify. So that's another way you can relax structuralism. So basically, structuralism is not a specific view, it's an approach that is constrained by these three theses: structural analysis of properties, structural analysis of experience, and kind of an assumption about how these structures relate to each other. And I use the strict structuralism just to kind of illustrate this generic approach. This generic approach, as I said before the talk, is something that I've been working on, and it has applications outside this kind of explanation for grasp. It's a view that can be grounded in psychology very well. It dovetails with psychology. It can explain other things. You might have seen discussions of the laws of appearance. Why is it that our experience of certain things are related to experiences of other things in a law-like way? Can explain perceptual variance. Why is it that veridical experiences of the same property can differ in phenomenal character? It can explain that. I think it conforms with what Dave Chalmers has called functionalist accounts of spatial concepts. Basically, it analyzes the spatial concepts in terms of their structural roles, and it provides a substantive account of the unity of consciousness. That's another area that I work on, and structuralism can do a really nice job in kind of telling us why unity of consciousness is fundamental to conscious experience. So these are some of its applications, and I guess I should stop here. I've talked for 1 whole hour. Thank you very much. So should I stop sharing?
Yes.
Stop sharing. All right.
So let me just thanks a lot, Farid, for this very rich and detailed presentation. Let me remember the rule of the game for people online. If you want to ask a question, just write question or Q in the chat. And as to the people here, maybe I can go there so that I can see that. Up to you. Okay.
I can see everyone that is. Is it just the 3 of you who are in the
Yes.
room, Alberto? Yeah. So I can see everyone.
Okay, so I first see a question by Julia and then a question by Andrea. And then, well, question by Julia, then a question by Fabrizio, and then a question by Andrea. Julia first.
I guess I just wanted to understand a little bit better how you're thinking about the structure of perceptual experience, or rather how the strict structuralist would. So when you were talking about the explanation of grasp, I guess the explanation would appeal to to experience something as a circle sometimes, I guess, is to experience it as occupying a certain role, and then you characterize the role. And then you said, well, to experience something as occupying a role, for you, that is not a matter of conceptualizing or anything like that. It's a Fregean mode of presentation that kind of goes into content, if you have to talk about content, or in the structure of the experience, I guess. And so I guess a question I had at that point was like, what are our reasons for thinking that there are such modes of presentation? Like modes of presentations that capture something like roles that are characterized in terms of a mathematical theory, for instance.
Yeah.
I don't know if the question makes sense. Like,
No, it does make sense. So the question is not why are the Fregean modes of presentation in perception and experience? It's why are there such sophisticated Fregean modes of presentation? How do we defend that here? Yeah, that's a great question. So there are two things that I want to say in response. One of them is that I am in the group of people who are interested in phenomenology, but don't think that phenomenology is just a matter of simple introspection. What we say about a structure of phenomenology, how rich or thin or thick it is a matter of triangulating a lot of sources of evidence. Of course, introspection matters, but the kind of role that phenomenology is supposed to explain in theorizing also matters. It also matters what empirical psychology tells us. So I think when we bring in all these sources of evidence, it has to be the case that if a structuralist says that there is this rich structural structure that we see experience, that should the evidence should support that, of course. And I think the jury is out about whether the evidence that we have supports that. So for example, take the empirical evidence. Whether our empirical evidence, at least coming from psychology, supports that depends on whether the recipe works. We have to look at the perceptual laws. We have to see which one can be consciously interpreted, which ones can be constitutively interpreted. Those are all questions that we have to handle. And then if it turns out that we get something close to the mathematical role, then we are entitled to attributing that. But that's an empirical question. So I think phenomenological questions are partly empirical. And, we shouldn't be outright reject the view that there is this rich structure and experience. So that's the first part of that. And I can say more about, examples of cases where I think it's very convincing that we experience richer structures. But let's set that aside. The second part of the answer is that suppose it turns out that when we do all of this, it turns out that strict structuralism is asking too much. Then there is a fallout position, which is to relax the strict structuralism. So the question again, between when it comes to the choice between a strict structuralism and other forms of structuralism is partly empirical in my view. We have to do our empirical theorizing, fortified by phenomenal, introspection and whatever other methods that we have for phenomenology. And at the end of the day, that also tells us which version of structuralism we have to adopt. And I'm open to stricter structuralism getting rejected at the end of the day. But then we have a question: is there another structuralist view in the ballpark that can do the job?
Thanks. So just as a quick follow-up, thinking about what role broadly phenomenological reflection plays here is that in telling us or in helping us figure out which are the truths that we find primitively compelling, or you're thinking more in terms of we look at something like how things appear to subjects and try to take that into account?
I think it's both. First it has to tell us, here are, truths that we find primitively compelling. That's kind of phenomenology, but it's also epistemology. These are the kind of things that people find intuitively true on their, reflection on their experience. But it has to also satisfy this, that, well, but yeah, let's say that I do find this primitively compelling, but I don't find that a structure in my experience. So it has to do the second job. So phenomenology is related, you're right, completely, is to both questions.
Okay, here, Fabrizio, thank you very much. So I didn't fully grasp every aspect, so perhaps my question will be naive. So you apply the structuralist view to the case of mid-level psychology. And it seems to me that it would be very interesting also to extend to the case of perceptual neuroscience, which is, at least, it seems to me really anti-structuralist, at least in the current view. So we've got this modular feature by feature, even if we restrict to the case of shape, spatial properties, we've got this modular feature by feature view. So we've got several regions that compute shape, several other regions that compute size, and then motion, several other regions that compute motion, and so on. And they usually have this, what you call transitional interpretation. So this motion parallax is just a transition from size to movement, so on, into depth. But you mentioned this interesting view, which is you call the constitutive one. So that's the integration of this information. I wonder, you also mentioned briefly, so just a curiosity, are there any empirical criteria, neuroscience criteria, to distinguish these two interpretations, so the transitional and the constitutive? Is there any way to decide? And you also mentioned that there's a limit, that not every psychological laws can be interpreted in a constitutive way, and that you got some idea to how to distinguish. So if you say something more about this.
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe you can help me with the answer. I have some crude answers. So I think that the distinction is empirically tractable. So I'm committed to there being empirical criteria for determining when the constitutive interpretation is appropriate and when the transitional one. And so one thing that one can look at in terms of the neuroscience is the neurocorrelates. It seems plausible that if a representation is constituted by some other representations, then there should be some interesting relationship between their neural correlates. There is an interesting question what that relationship should be. It doesn't have to be that in terms of anatomical regions, for example, the neural correlates coincide, because you can have, as we can have a dynamic interpretation of what the representation is. And it doesn't have to be that, they're temporally coincide. But I would say that one area that is going to be extremely relevant is an area where we study the relationship between these neural correlates of the representations. So if it turns out that for example, my representation of apparent size completely disappears before I have my representation of depth, right? Then that is some evidence in support of the transitional interpretation, right? So if my to represent depth is a matter of how I what I'm doing with apparent size, then if I don't have the representation of apparent size, then on the constitutive interpretation I shouldn't have the representation of depth. So if it turns out that our neuroscience tells us, as you were pointing out, that these representations are in completely different areas, but they also cannot be co-activated. One of them is not activated while the other one is. That's evidence for the transitional interpretation, as opposed to constitutive. Another source that is relevant is that the constitutive interpretation, because it's a claim about the Constitution, not just representations per se, but conscious representations, has to satisfy some requirement that the representations should be conscious. Here's an example. So for example, we know that another method for representing depth is binocular disparity, right? The image that falls on our two retinals are a little bit slightly different from each other in the sense that their distance from the ocula is different. But that is information that is not consciously, in no sense, is consciously represented. So the constitutive interpretation of that is not going to do the job that we want. So we can tap into kind of literature and evidence that is relevant to determining what representations are conscious and what representations are not conscious. But all of this kind of empirical evidence is compounded by the fact that there is a huge amount of disagreement about the neurocorrelates of consciousness, right? There are people who think that all the neurocorrelates of consciousness are in the higher regions because they have the global broadcast theory of consciousness. Some people think that you need feedback loops. There are all these so it's a very complicated debate. But I think the empirical evidence has to look at the neurocorrelates. It has to look at what representations are conscious, which ones are not, and all of those are very complicated. I don't know if you have any suggestions for me about more stuff.
Perhaps it's just a not so useful suggestion. So there is a hype in perceptual neuroscience and in neuroscience in general for these new methods of neuroimaging that are sometimes called representational similarity analysis, which is which is quite different. It is neuroimaging, so it's fMRI, but it's a new way to look at the data. So they are not just look at the activation of a single area, but just how the voxel on entire regions behave when are modulated by the stimulus. And then you got this representational matrix that shows activities for given stimuli, and then you can compare to other stimuli. Then you probably look at this kind of literature. There's a lot of them, also in the combination between size information, depth information, and that might be something that goes strongly in the direction of a structuralist.
Yeah, that sounds pretty structuralist. Yeah. I should mention those are also kind of support for the theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Andrea.
Thank you very much, Farid, for the really deep and interesting talk. I surely need to think better about what you said, but in fact, I have just a real general question that it is also sort of, clarificatory question. At the beginning, you talked about the Fregean view, or the idea that the phenomenal character of experience depends by the way we perceive the world. And then you said that grasping is an epistemic relation to some special properties, or that means that perceptual experience essentially puts us in the position to find some truths of these essential properties of the object, truths that work as structural rules. Then you explain. Well, I was wondering whether on this basis it is possible to consider your structuralism like a special, particular kind of conceptualism. Not obviously in the sense that the essential truths we grasp are inferential truths, but in a weaker sense, we would say, in the sense that they are these truths are originally perceived or grasped in such a way that they can play a role inside an inferential chain.
Very, very good, Andrea. This is actually my view because I'm, I when I did my dissertation many, many years ago, uh, I kind of defended a view that was inspired by McDowell, but it was a view that I called proto-conceptualism, where, it is not that perceptual experience is conceptual in the strict sense of the term, but it has the kind of structural richness that then is mirrored in inferential roles. And that's why it kind of grounds, the acquisition of concepts. And this is actually one of in the project that I'm working, it is another application of the structuralist view. So I completely agree with you. There is, although these are not full-blown conceptual capacities, but the seeds of concepts are kind of embedded in the structure of experience, observational concepts. So your suggestion is it hits home here. Yeah, yeah. Did you want to,
Thank you very much. I really, really like this idea.
Thank you.
I don't see other questions from the online people and not even from the in-person people. So maybe it's time for me to ask you a question, Farid. I agree with you on the fact that I found the Russellian position quite hard to follow because of the constraint it has. That is that the fact that the nature of the relevant property must be somehow manifested into the phenomenal character of the experience. But if this is the case, unless we want to buy some form of disjunctivism, we are forced to say that both in the case of a non-veridical experience and in the case of a veridical experience, we are able to grasp, according to the Russellian, the nature of a property, which in the non-veridical case is not instantiated. And I don't manage to understand how we can possibly grasp the nature of a property if that property is not instantiated. And I think that one of the advantages of your approach is that by resorting to a sort of Fregean mode of presentation, this worry can be in a way solved, in the sense that if our experience of the nature of a certain property is an experience of a certain item as plain or having a certain structural role, that means that even in the case of non-veridical experience, we can manage to grasp that sort of role in a non-veridical way, if you like. That is, I can, in a case in which I'm facing something that is not elliptical, for instance, but it seems to me to be elliptical, for instance, I can experience this very thing as occupying a certain structural role, even if in point of fact it does not occupy that. If this is the case, I would like to know whether you are ready to extend your approach even to the case of hallucinatory experiences in which there is no object whatsoever that one is facing. And moreover, if this is the case, what is the relation between, say, the mode of presentation in your account and the real nature of a given property, since you can entertain the mode of presentation independently of whether this property is instantiated?
Yeah, that's an important question, and the dialectic here for me gets kind of complicated a lot because I have some non-standard views about this. So let me let me start with this idea that so if I understand if I understand the kind of question, there seems to be something like a kind of dilemma here, right? If I say, there is some pressure that forces me to say, because I'm also a Phrygian, that even in the case of hallucination, we have some sort of grasp of the nature of properties that are presented. But then that pushes me away from saying that the grasp that it has is from, as you said, real properties. I would say it's like property instantiation, concrete ones. So one push is to kind of like say we have these uh, grasps in the bad cases, if you like, hallucinations, misrepresentations, and that kind of takes us far away from grasping a grasp of real properties in the world. But the other option, which is to put grasp as a relation to uninstantiated properties, is also kind of not desirable. So we are kind of in a dilemma. Am I right that you kind of presented the dilemma to me, but
You can put my
in
question
a
this
very
way.
nice way, not as a dilemma, not under mode of presentation.
I like this way you're putting my question. I like it.
So here is what I think. I do think that we have, in the case of hallucinations and the bad cases, we do have grasp of properties, and those properties are uninstantiated. But in those cases, that grasp piggybacks on the grasp that we have on the in the good cases. So the account of the good cases, the canonical cases, those cases that are relevant to the nature of perceptual experience, is central. And the account of what happens in the bad cases is derivative of the account of the good cases. So if I learn something about the nature of circularity in a hallucination, if I do learn, I have a paper in mind, the 2020 paper about hallucinations, that I'm arguing that a lot of standard assumptions about hallucinations that philosophers have made are kind of rejectionable, rejectable. So if it is the case that we grasp something about circularity in the case of hallucination, it is because of an indiscriminatory relation between a hallucination case and a good case. It is not because the same story that we say about the good case applies to the hallucination case. And the reason I think that the story that we give about the good case does not apply to the hallucination case is that ultimately the Phrygian story has to be supplied with some sort of context relative relations that determine the content relations, determine what the targets of these modes of presentations are. Modes of presentation themselves do not sufficiently determine reference, if you like. We need to appeal to contextual factors. And those contextual relations are only available in the good cases, not in the bad cases. So I want to kind of, and this is similar to some of the things that disjunctivists have said, basically prioritize the good cases and give an account of good cases, and then kind of apply that, derive an account of what happens in the bad cases from what is happening in the good cases. That's kind of the strategy that I have to deal with the dilemma. So I'm not, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Does it entail for you something like the disjunctivist move, as you said, that is that in point of fact, bad experiences and good experiences do not share the phenomenal character, because bad experiences are parasitic on good experiences. It seems the only thing that we have is that they are indistinguishable, but for this would be a non-standard Phrygian move. Let's say for a Phrygian would say.
But I'm a non-standard Phrygian because I think, so usually Phrygians are pure internalists, right? I am a Phrygian who thinks that perceptual experience is a relation to particulars in the environment, but the phenomenal character is not determined by those particulars and property instantiation, still it is the case that the phenomenal character is determined by the mode of presentation. So that's the kind of Fregean view that I have. It has some elements of the relationalist views, the naive realist views. And I have to say something about hallucinations. My response is not the standard disjunctivist response. I actually think that in a lot of cases, well, you know, hallucinations are discriminable introspectively from normal veridical perceptual experiences. And you know, the evidence that we have for it is inconclusive for the existence of such hallucinations.
Okay, thank you. We still have two questions. I see another question from Julia among the online group, and then there is a question by Matteo here. Julia, please.
If Matteo wants to go first, I can also wait. Okay, so it was just a small question about something you said about the option of denying grasp. And I guess maybe it would just help me understand a little bit more how you're thinking of grasp. So you said something like that if we deny grasp, then we end up having to say that phenomenal character grounds at best something like some truths about the subject, like self-knowledge. I mean, I guess puts us in a position to know or find out about truths about us or something like that. And I guess I was wondering, couldn't someone say, well, I don't want to commit to the claim that perceptual experience essentially puts us in a position to find essential truths about properties primitively compelling, but that does not mean that it does not put us in a position to find out about the world. I mean, it could put us in a position to find out about, I guess, what particular instantiations are like if I perceive something that is red, my experience puts me in a position to know about what that thing looks like.
Yeah.
It's not obvious that it puts me in a position to know something about redness, one might think. Or is that...
No, that's a great question. That is an area where I think I'm gonna meet a lot of resistance of the sort that you're describing. So you know, someone might say, but yeah, maybe I learned something qualitatively about, you know, the world. What it is, I learned what it is like. But why should that knowledge be related to this kind of learning essential truths? Maybe, you know, there were two things that are kind of like relevant here. One of them is essential truths about properties, but even why should it be essential truths about property instantiations, right? I think those are related. The essential truth, you learn essential truths about property instantiations, and those are kind of the essential truths that you learn about the properties that these are instantiations of. So the challenge is to say, well, I learned something about what red is like, but why should we commit ourselves to learning essential truths about redness? This is my response, and tell me if it convinces you, because I think ultimately, if someone presses you on, tell me more about what it is to learn what redness is like, you have to say something ultimately about learning essential truths about it. This, in the case of spatial properties, is specifically, I think, is more convincing. Maybe with the colors, because there's this kind of non-structural component. You can say, I learned that, you know, pointing to the intrinsic quality of redness. But with the spatial properties, if someone says, I learned what circularity is qualitatively, I want to know what that is, what it is to know the qualitative nature of circularity. And I think ultimately we want to answer that question. We have to kind of commit ourselves to something about learning essential truths about that. This actually takes us back to what I said about Brewer and Campbell. Brewer and Campbell are kind of what they say literally is something like what you said. They use categorical nature. But they say, we learn the categorical nature of these properties in having those categorical or qualitative nature of these properties. But there is a significant question: what does that amount to, or what does that entail? Campbell, in the 2006 paper, Revelation versus transparency, he talks about he gets close to answering that question, but the answer he gives is in terms of the ability to manipulate things. So to know the categorical nature of color is to know what properties you should change in order to change the color of things. I think that view has obvious problems in terms of kind of telling us, as a view that tells us what it is to know the categorical nature of things. So I think ultimately, if you want to explain what it is to know the qualitative nature, categorical nature of these properties, it's very hard to save a position to say, I learned something about the categorical nature of circularity, but there is no essential truth about circularity that I have learned in having that experience. That position is not a position that can be easily maintained. That's kind of my probably not satisfactory answer to your
No,
question.
I mean, that was helpful. Thanks. I'll think about it.
Matteo.
Okay, probably my question is just the naive version of the question that Julia has just asked, but I will ask anyway. So it's a very naive doubt, but suppose that someone, a purely fictional character, told you, look, what we were looking for at the start was an account of how we can grasp essential truth about properties through perception. And what you have given us is an account how we can learn through perception what role a certain property has. But I mean, in principle, those could be two very different things. So what you have explained as and what we were looking for might be, in principle, very different things. Because take just a very bad analogy, but the mode of presentation in many of Frege's examples, the way a certain object is presented, might not be an essential feature of that object.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe, probably, again, this is probably the naive version of the question that Julia has just asked, and so you probably have already replied to it. But when it's just a little addition is this idea that we have example of cases where the mode of presentation is not an essential feature.
Yeah. I actually think that this is different from Julia's question.
Okay.
But it is a very significant question. Again, it's successful Fregean story shouldn't just give us, you're completely right, shouldn't just give us modes of presentation, an analysis of modes of presentation. It should give us an analysis of modes of presentations that are essential, right, to the properties. And I completely agree with you that that's one of the demands. But I do think I have delivered that demand, or a structuralist does deliver that demand. And that's because of the first thesis of structuralism. The first thesis of structuralism says to be, for example, circular is to occupy that structural role, right? You might disagree with that. You might disagree with the structuralist, but that is the thesis of a structuralist, that structural role is capturing the essence of circularity. It's an essential property of circularity that it occupies this structural role. So if you start with the mathematics and you say mathematics is telling us, the intuition is that mathematics tells us the essence of these properties, what it is to be a circle. And those essential truths of math are essential of what it is to be circular. So structuralism is striving to deliver what you're demanding. You might disagree with that. Someone might say, no, circularity has this essence that is over and above what mathematics is telling us about circles. If you have that view, you will be unsatisfied by this, and you might say, well, then the mode of presentations that you have given us are contingent modes of presentation. But if a structuralism is true, it falls out of the view that the modes of presentations that are thus identified are essential modes of presentation.
If I may have a follow-up on that, probably your thesis relies on an assumption that is that you are dealing with observational properties. And the nature of observational properties can be captured in structuralist and possibly even in mathematical terms. And so if maybe somebody would be discontent with your account if she had something like a conception of the properties that you have mobilized as intrinsic properties, as having something like a hidden nature.
Yeah.
But probably somebody who believes that completely denies the whole enterprise from the very beginning. She might even criticize resilience by saying, well, whatever is a sort of perceptual relation cannot give us any hint about the hidden nature of a property if a property is not conceived as observational but as being intrinsic. So I think that your account is perfectly fine, provided that it is an account that concerns observational properties in Mike Martin's sense.
Yeah, so the whole package, yeah, you're right completely. The whole package works for observational properties because we have a structural analysis of the property plus a structural analysis of the experience of the property, and that they match. So this is really well fitted for observational properties. But components of the view may work for other properties too. So, we have a structuralist position in philosophy of math about, the nature of mathematical objects. We have, or in philosophy of science about the nature of the theoretical entities that, science talks about. We have the structuralism of physics also. So like the whole structuralist camp, and of people might say, no, it's not just observational properties. What it is to be electron is to feel the role that theoretical physics tells us electrons play. All of those are, we can give an structural analysis. But you're right, if we add that the other items, that this structural role is supposed to be revealed in experience, all those kind of things, then it's basically something close to properties that are in some sense observable, although people are skeptical about whether we can circumscribe the class of observable properties. But it's those properties. And in the talk, my label is sensible properties, and I limit the thesis to sensible properties. One more thing about the kind of idea of these intrinsic hidden natures. Of course, there are some people who are dialectically out, as it were, because they're not that people who accept grasp but adopt a different explanation. Those are people who even deny grasp. They say, we don't learn anything about the nature of these properties through experience. Those would be, of course, dialectically out. I don't have an answer for those. I haven't been trying to give an answer to those. The target audience are people who accept grasp, but are wondering, how do we explain grasp?
Okay, thank you. Seems to me that I don't see any other question either in the online from the online people or from the in-person people. So maybe it's time to thank Farid once again for this very rich presentation. And, it would be great to have you sometime in Italy, and when you will have the opportunity of getting to Europe, let us know so that we can invite you.
I would love to come. My wife is half Italian.
Great, I didn't know. Okay, so you
I
might have some
found her.
opportunity. Okay, let's hope that after the pandemic, we will be some chance.
Yeah, so we sometimes travel to Italy, and actually my wedding was in Italy.
Where
They
about?
they are from Garbagnate Milanese. That's where
Okay.
her
So
family
not
is.
very far
So
from here.
not that far from Torino.
Okay.
I would have loved to come, but unfortunately,
Sure.
because of the pandemic,
Let us know your plans in the future. Maybe we will manage to find another.
yeah, we are hoping we might spend a year or a semester at least in Italy in the next year or so.
Okay.
So
So let's keep in touch about that. Great.
Yeah, I would love to meet the people in your group and chat more. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay.
Ciao.
Thanks a lot again. Ciao. Goodbye. See
Bye.
you soon.
See you.